So, for the next half an hour, we're in the hands of Historic Royal Palaces. This is Rosie and Deborah, who are going to talk to us about their Access Fund for schools. As with all of these talks, after we've heard about your work, there's a chance to ask questions. So do think up those questions and save those, and then we'll have a Q&A after they've spoken. So I'll hand over to you. Thanks both.
Hello everyone, I'm Rosie. I'm an assistant learning producer at Historic Royal Palaces, and I kind of look after the day-to-day of the Access Fund. So as Anna says, we'll be speaking for about 30 minutes and then have an opportunity for questions at the end.
And I'm Deb. I'm a learning producer in the schools team as well, and we both have oversight of the Access Fund for schools, and hopefully you'll get some interesting nuggets from us today, and potentially be able to roll out a scheme similar to us at your institutions.
Yeah, so this presentation will focus on our Access Fund at Historic Royal Palaces and outline the journey that we've been on as we've developed the fund, looking at removing barriers to school visits. So we'll highlight the impact the fund has had so far and suggest tips for how a similar scheme may be developed elsewhere. So just to introduce you to Historic Royal Palaces, for any of you who don't know, we are an independent charity, and we are responsible for the care of 6 palaces, so 5 based in London. So you've got the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, Kensington Palace, Banqueting House, Kew Palace, and then this one in the corner is Hillsborough Castle and Gardens, which is over in Northern Ireland.
Just a little bit about our schools programme. We have a schools programme that is across Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace and Kensington Palace. And that is for reception up to A level and also special schools. And our content links to the curriculum. And it's on site, online and in outreach form as well. And the main purpose of why we offer sessions to schools on site is to bring history to life for our students, to inspire an interest and a desire to find out more about history. And of course, it's history where it happens at one of our beautiful sites. Our sessions are generally based on site in the palaces, and they're delivered by costume presenters who are educators as well. And very importantly, the costume helps to also bring to life that experience for the students and young people. We also have an offer for domestic and international students who are just visiting on their own with no session. And it's really important to say at this stage that we do charge, generally speaking, we'll come on to the fund in a minute, generally speaking, for our school sessions, but at a highly reduced rate. And this is because we're a charity, and any revenue from ticket sales will go towards the preservation of our site and the continued development of our programmes.
So moving on to the Access Fund itself. So the Access Fund at Historic Royal Palaces is now entering its 7th year. And it was born out of the desire to enable audiences that were not visiting Historic Royal Palaces due to cultural and financial barriers. So it provides funded visits to our sites for schools who might not usually be able to come. So there's lots of research to kind of affirm why the Access Fund is possible. So this quote kind of sums it up really well. So it says, heritage has a unique role to play in promoting both societal and individual well-being. It offers the intangible, a sense of rootedness and identity of place and understanding, and that comes from the Heritage Alliance. There's also more recent research, which comes from the Sutton Trust, which gives a really cohesive picture of kind of what schools are facing at the moment. So it found that while schools facing cuts is nothing new, the rate at which these cuts are being made is increasing massively. So since 2022, reports of cuts to trips and outings have more than doubled, now standing at 50%, up from 21%, a proportion that is even higher in schools with the most disadvantaged intakes, going right up to 68%. And these findings are especially concerning given the importance of school trips in broadening the horizons of young people in low-income families who are less likely to have experiences like these outside of school.
So as we've said before, HRP, Historic Royal Palaces, is a charity, so we need to generate our own funds. We don't receive any public funding. And charging to our sites, though, for schools, we understand, even at a reduced rate, is still incredibly prohibitive for some schools. They can't come. And our charitable purpose means that we prioritise schools coming on site, come what may. Incredibly important to us. So as an organisation, financially, the priority has been, one of the major priorities is the Access Fund for Schools. And we'll come on to what that exactly means. But the Access Fund for Schools was established to enable school children who otherwise experience financial, social, cultural barriers to making a visit outside the classroom to come to one of our sites. So key aims to provide children with a high quality and impactful learning experience that increases that cultural capital that we hear a lot about. Support teachers and schools to make the most out of an educational visit when they actually do come. And then developing ongoing relationships with teachers and schools. So it's not just about a one-off visit, and that's our intention anyway. And on our journey, which we'll come on to more about this fund, the lessons we've learned have been around internal and external advocacy, as you can imagine. And as Rosie's talked about, it's the evidence-based learning and research that we've done that can then inform those funders, and we'll come on to that as well, why this is such an important thing to fund. We've also learned, as you might imagine, that starting small and growing is a sustainable and achievable way to achieve a fund like this. Really important to work closely with a development team or fundraising team or whatever you have in your organisation, who in turn work with trustees to bring in the funds. So it's not ourselves doing that, but we are actually working internally to advocate. Oh, is it still being?
So if we go back to the beginning of the fund, so we started the Access Fund for Schools in 2017. And when it started, the fund allowed for free entry and education sessions at both Hampton Court Palace and the Tower of London. And schools could apply for up to 105 spaces for Key Stage 1 to 5 students. And special schools could apply for up to 12 students. We did have an eligibility criteria. So schools had to be state funded, primary, secondary or special, and located in an inner or outer London borough. We also prioritised applications with one or more of the following characteristics. So pupils with 30% of pupils eligible for pupil premium, 50% pupils with a first language known to be anything other than English, and 15% of pupils with special educational needs. Although these didn't need to be, these weren't considered in relation to special schools. Successful applicants, as well as their school visit, were invited to attend a teacher familiarisation day at their chosen site to help them plan for their visit. In our first year, we had a target of 5,000 students to be funded, and we surpassed this with 5,575 student visitors that year.
So growth of the fund, year 2. That's 2018-19. So again, our target was around 5,000 students, focusing still just on London schools for now, but we included Kensington Palace into the mix at this point. And then year 3, which was 2019-20, we had higher ambitions. That involved receiving 134 applications from different schools, and we had offered 7,407 places to students. But then, of course, the pandemic hit, so we didn't manage to make those visits happen.
But when we came back from the pandemic, and we had seen the success of one of our other national projects, the Super Bloom Schools project, which offers funded visits to the Tower of London, we reassessed the parameters of the Access Fund. So we know that our sites are of huge national importance, and we really wanted schools to be able to visit us regardless of where they were in the UK. So we extended the fund to schools across the UK, and you can see this map here. So each of the pins represents a school that visited via the Access Fund in 21-22.
So opening up the fund naturally, as you can imagine, we discovered that the biggest barrier for schools was the cost of travel. So we set up a travel subsidy scheme. It wasn't that straightforward, but we did decide at that point to set one up, and that's financial contributions towards travel. So following research, we decided to go with a travel banding approach, which you can see with the colour coding there. And that's offering schools a set amount of money towards their travel based on the group size and the proximity to our sites. So it's 2 different amounts allocated per band. That's largely based on whether we thought a school would be hiring 1 or 2 coaches. And it's important to build travel costs into any costings you're making when applying for external funding.
This year that we're currently in, 23-24, that was the first year that we offered the travel funding. And you can see in this map here, actually, our national reach has grown. My favourite thing is seeing those 2 dots right at the top. We had schools visiting from as far away as Inverness. So we introduced the travel funding, but we are still finding that actually travel costs are the most prohibitive. So we are looking at increasing our funding amounts for this year and are actually hoping to fund places for 17,000 pupils at our sites for the 24-25 academic year coming up.
So evaluation, obviously important to do it. We were lucky enough to be able to fund some more substantial evaluation in academic year 22-23. So we recruited the external evaluation company PeopleTree to produce a more in-depth evaluation piece for us. And this was the year, bearing in mind, where we'd gone national, but we hadn't actually introduced the travel subsidy at this stage. So their research affirmed the need for Access Fund as a way of supporting access to heritage sites, as you can imagine. And that's for 60% of teachers who were interviewed, never having taken a school group to a heritage site previously without the fund. So 72% of teachers said they would not have come to one of our sites if they hadn't received the funding. Only 10% felt they would still have made it without the funding, and the remainder would have just done something local. So the vast majority of teachers, 97%, agreed they would like to take part in a similar trip. And 94% of teachers saying that they felt it increased their students' cultural capital. Okay, so part of the evaluation had lots of lovely qualitative feedback. And the research found that the fund delivered multiple practical, cultural, social, learning benefits. And these included enrichment and joy, access to experiences, broadening horizons, social capital, language acquisition, and passion for history. So the research also focused on specific children, creating case studies on their experiences. And here's an example here. Charlie, not their real name, was from a chaotic home life and presents as sad and has play therapy at school. His teacher reported the following. I will read this, even though you can read it yourself. It's quite impactful to do this. He's quite an unhappy little boy. He has play therapy and there's lots going on at home. He always looks very sad. He has just come up to me with a massive chocolate smile and said, "This is the best day ever." Today has given him an experience he has never had. He has connected with the actor and his history. Being chosen to be knighted made him feel special, which probably doesn't happen to him very often. These are the precious moments these types of visits give these children. It has made my heart a little bit bigger. And we're really pleased to say that this actual quote is right at the top of our new organisational strategy document, which the whole organisation subscribes to, which was published in April.
So we commissioned a second report for this academic year to make sure we saw the impact of the newly introduced travel funding. And we did change our approach slightly. So in the first year, we focused on pupil surveys, teacher surveys, evaluators accompanying visits on site. And then in this second year, we added on to that our evaluators going into the schools themselves, speaking to the pupils there to really kind of try and understand the schools that were visiting us through the fund, what their challenges were within school, and to get lots and lots of data. So whilst the full report hasn't been published yet, we do have some statistics. So in the question, how likely is it that you would have made a trip such as this as a school group without the HRP travel bursary? 63% of teachers said very unlikely and 22% said unlikely. So we've also found with the introduction of travel bursaries that we're reaching even more diverse schools and that are facing bigger challenges within their schools. And the addition of funding has allowed us to reach those. So one teacher whose school visited as part of the fund said the following: "Without the funding for both entry and travel, we would not be here. We have a policy of not asking parents for money, and school funds for trips are limited to venues and activities locally with low associated costs." It's a pretty depressing picture. But teachers have also been really generous in sharing work that their pupils have done, so pre-visit and post-visit. I received a bunch of letters that pupils had written to their teacher to say why they wanted to be included on the trip to the Tower of London, which I will say was probably one of the funnest half an hours at work I've had in a while, reading through all the letters. But this is just one of them. And it says, "To Mr. Loudon, I would love to go on the trip because I barely have been to London and I would like to go because we can create memories that can last forever. So I really want to go with my class." So that's kind of the history of the fund. But looking at where we're going to go next, as Deb mentioned earlier about our strategy, Historic Royal Palaces has just produced a new strategy with the headline, "A Charity for Everyone." So to really develop the Access Fund across the organisation, everyone in the organisation needs to see its value. And this strategy has really allowed that to happen. So to give you a few examples, at the launch of the new strategy, there was a video shown including a segment about the Access Fund, which is now also actually going to be part of the onboarding for new staff at the organisation. We had some members of staff run the London Marathon raising money for the Access Fund. And we continue our work advocating for the fund internally and externally, even being here today. And our newest report for the evaluation is going to be shown to members of staff across the organisation. So we've invited front of house staff, members of staff from press, just so everyone can see just how impactful these visits can be. So now we're just going to have a quick run through of sort of a toolkit we've put together about how a successful scheme could be set up elsewhere, sort of taking into account different sizes, site needs and audiences.
So reach and eligibility criteria, something we thought about very early on at inception. And this is 7 years ago. We've had this initial thinking, so it's been quite a while. We wanted to make sure, obviously, that we were reaching the right schools, enabling them to be able to apply successfully. At the time, as Rosie said before, we had a minimum criteria of 30% pupil premium in a school, 15% SEND and 50% EFL. Over time, we've tweaked that and we've taken the EFL away because we understand that rural communities aren't reflective of that percentage, and they are many very isolated and in need communities rurally. We're mindful of our prioritising our offer to the most in need whilst maintaining a sense of scale and what's sustainable for us, as in, can we manage the demand? And that's something that we're constantly looking at.
Yeah, so I guess another thing to think about is site capacity and staff capacity. So we run a very large schools programme on site. Just this year, we've had we're looking to hit 166,000 pupil visits across our sites. So we really needed to think about how we would accommodate these visits as well as that. So we tried different things. We opened bookings earlier for Access Fund schools, although we didn't actually find that worked. As it turns out, schools like to book a bit later on in the year. We also had to consider, coming back from the pandemic, that we were only offering school visits 3 days a week. So we had to kind of build that into our planning. We've also previously offered the Access Fund visits from September to the end of the spring term to avoid the busiest months. And this was kind of to protect some of our revenue from the busiest months, and because we knew that they were just going to be absolutely manic on site. But then this year we've refined that because we wanted to make sure that actually the Access Fund schools could come in the summer term, because we have a seasonal offer, so wellbeing programs. So we've changed that so that they can come until the end of May instead. And this is all kind of working with different teams across the organisation. So we talk with our bookings team a lot, our operations team, to kind of get their idea on things, and I'm constantly liaising with them. It's also kind of worth thinking about the associated admin. There is a lot of admin involved in travel bursaries, but it is definitely manageable. One of the things I found is schools do need a lot of chasing. Even when they've written a beautifully emotive application for the fund, they will still need to be chased for invoices and things, which I found is something to kind of take into consideration with your funding year. So we had a real bottleneck at the end of the financial year when all the schools sent in their invoices at one point. So that's just kind of something to take into consideration when you're planning for staffing and things.
Okay, so finance, costing things, important to cost up, obviously, and consider all of your costs. So that for us, that's presenter costs, admission costs, travel, general entry, all of those things that we're waiving for Access Fund schools. For every successful mainstream school, we can fund up to 105 pupils. Essentially, that's 3 big classes worth, and that's for admission and 1 session and relevant travel subsidy. However, we've found over the years from scrutinising the application data that actually the average class size, group size is 60 students, or 2 classes worth. So that's helped us to with our costings and forecasting for our numbers. And similarly with the travel banding, we also allow for a certain amount of schools per band. It's not very scientific, but we try and kind of anticipate the proportion of schools that will be coming from each geographical band. And then again, that helps us to refine our costings. And so then when we're actually putting in a bid for funding, we've kind of got a sensible amount of money in mind.
So just looking at the end-to-end process and how the Access Fund year works. So in March, kind of April time, we begin marketing the fund, which Deb will kind of speak through a bit in a minute. And then in April to May, online applications open. So our online application form is currently on our website. And that will stay up for about 6 weeks. Well, 6 weeks. But schools are encouraged to apply sooner rather than later, because we do kind of work on a first come, first served basis. And then once we've sifted through the applications in June to July, successful schools are invited to book their visit and their teacher familiarisation day. And then this part in September, October is the first time we've done this, but we will open applications for a second time. Again, this is our learnings from the last 7 years, that we found that actually secondary schools and SEND schools were less likely to apply in the summertime, about knowing kind of who's going to be in their classes and that kind of thing. We also found that even if schools were successful, not all of them ended up taking us up on our offer. So that's to kind of account for any drop-offs we have or anything like that. So we'll reopen the fund in autumn. Schools again will be notified if their application has been successful, and to book their visit. So then September to May, the on-site visits will happen. And then across the year, schools will be able to invoice us for their travel costs, which are agreed when they're told they're successful. And schools can invoice us for their travel visits from 6 weeks before their visit date. And that coincides with our cancellation deadline as well.
In terms of marketing, there are several ways we try to reach schools. So we actually pay for an e-shop to go out to all schools nationally through a marketing agency. And likewise, we communicate with local MPs through a database that we subscribe to, because often MPs are big advocates for us for their areas, their constituencies. We use social media, as you can imagine, and we have a teacher network that we also communicate via. And we also do ad hoc communications ourselves to cultural bridge organisations and places like that might have their own networks. And then we've also built up a loyal group of schools over the years, and it's word of mouth through them as well. But we still need to make sure that we're very clear on when applications open, because we operate on a first come, first served basis.
So, as I mentioned before, as part of a successful application, teachers are also invited to come along on a familiarisation day. And that's to ensure that teachers are prepared for their visit. As we heard in one of the statistics before, the majority of teachers visiting via the fund haven't led a trip like this before. So a familiarisation day, up to 3 teachers from a successful school, or actually any school visiting, can book onto one of the days. And it includes a chance to network with other teachers, an introduction to our programmes, a logistical tour led by one of us in the schools team. So I always say that's the less glamorous tour, but it's kind of showing them where the toilets are, where the lunchrooms are. And then they'll get the more glamorous fun tour from one of our costumed presenters, who will kind of give them a taster session and some really fun historical stories to share with their pupils when they're on site. Teachers can also bring a guest, so they can bring a friend or family member who can explore our site whilst they're in the session. And we looked at this in the evaluation as well. And actually, we found that the teachers who came on the familiarisation day did feel very supported and more confident about their visit. So we've got a quote here from one of the teachers who says, "I have to say the teacher day was probably one of the best that I've been on, because it was a really lovely mix of history, but also the practical bits too. The tour was excellent, as they showed you the things that you really needed to see, like where the toilets are and the lunchroom spaces." And 70% of teachers rated the day as excellent. However, we are aware we've expanded the fund nationally, so that teachers coming on site for the familiarisation day has become a little bit trickier. So we're currently in the midst of developing a digital offer, which we're looking at including some pre-recorded walkarounds and some online Q&As.
Just a bit more on evaluation. It's really important to stress how important it is to have access to a robust data set, and monitoring and progress reporting, it all feeds into that. And then in turn back to your funders, because this is a yearly ask for us, we need to be showing the impact and the importance of the fund. Having strong qualitative and quantitative data and information is, of course, really important. We get asked a lot by our development team to contribute to various reports they're writing. And it's the hearts and minds quotes as well, which we've read some to you. Really important stuff as well as numbers. And just showing how impactful and transformative a scheme like this really, really is for people.
So with that, I'm going to leave you with 2 quotes, which when they came through from our evaluators, they actually made me feel a bit emotional. And I think just in a few sentences, they probably sum up what we're trying to achieve with the Access Fund better than we have done in the whole half an hour. So this first one is from a year 10 girl who visited from a small school in Stoke-on-Trent. And she said, "I've always thought I wanted to go to university, but this has given me even more of a push, and it now feels closer. It's shown me that there are broader opportunities outside of Stoke. It changes your mindset to think what you could achieve within England and even beyond." And the second quote came from a group that visited from Newcastle. They were a small SEN group, and because of their size, they were able to use some of the travel funding for accommodation as well. And the teacher said this. So she said, being from an area of very high deprivation, the young people from Cedars faced numerous challenges, including financial constraints and anxiety. However, the opportunity to access cultural capital through this trip broke down significant barriers. Finance ceased to be an issue, enabling us to provide more than just an educational experience. It was about developing their independent skills, fostering connections with peers outside their usual circles, and experiencing a level of camaraderie they may not have encountered before. This trip wasn't just about learning history, it was about enriching lives and creating lasting memories. So thank you very much for listening. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Deborah and Rosie. Right. Oh, hands coming up already. Right. When I bring the mic to you, can you just hold it very close to your mouth and say who you are, where you're from?
Hello, I'm Rachel, Head of Learning and Participation at the National Memorial Arboretum. I just wondered around the funding. So was it an external funder that you were able to approach, and how long was that funding cycle for, and what kind of happens when that funding's not there? Is there something organisationally that's in place to underpin that?
Yeah, so I mean, our funding comes from external funders and internal. We do raise revenue through our Paid for Schools programme, so some money comes from that. And then we do have a lot of external funding as well, which comes from our sort of campaign board.
It's a funny one in our organisation because the way our development team works is they're bringing money in for all kinds of charitable purposes, and we're kind of benefiting from that pot. So it's hard for us personally to say how all that works. But there's lots of, I think my understanding is lots of continuous funders. Some funders they're from the north. They've got a particular priority to focus on what work we're doing in the north. So that would definitely come to Access Fund. But we're not part of the sort of daily backwards and forwards with.
So rather than it being this programme specifically funded by one external funder, or it's through a pot of money? Yep, so it's through more general funding.
Some funders do fund the Access Fund specifically, but a lot of it does come from a general pot. And as I said, there are things that are happening in our organisation as well. So we did have people running the London Marathon to raise money for the fund.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Any more questions? I think I saw some hands about to come up over this side. Did I imagine that? Oh, it was the same question. Excellent. Yes.
Hello, I'm Grace from the Roald Dahl Museum and Story Centre. I just wonder what kind of uptake you have for your teacher familiarisation visits and what kind of numbers you have attending on that.
Yeah, so we've run the familiarisation days for a little while, and historically, we didn't have huge uptakes, but the way we've kind of framed it now is that it's kind of part of the access funding. So as a successful school, that is part of your kind of what you receive coming to the familiarisation day. So it's a tricky one because sometimes it's hard to get teachers there, but then every time they come, they're really thankful for it. But yeah, we've definitely had a higher uptake since we've included it as their kind of parcel of funding, that visit. But as we say, we are kind of looking at how we can include those teachers coming all the way from Inverness and giving them that kind of same experience and building their confidence before their visit.
But we run 2 per term per site for the autumn and the spring terms. And then we can have up to about 50 coming, to give you a sense.
Great. Thank you. We've got one question here and then I'll come over there.
Hi, I'm Anita from the National Army Museum. Do you find that schools will choose a funded visit over like a virtual session, or do you find that it affects your virtual learning at all, or is this actually extra visits?
I haven't seen any kind of numbers or workings around it, but I don't think so. I think what they offer are very different, and there's nothing to say that schools couldn't do both, I suppose.
I mean, you do the bookings. We don't get much in the way of online bookings through the Access Fund because they when they're successful with an application, then they're invited to book, and it's generally an on-site session. I think, yeah.
Interesting question, though, to think about with evaluation, isn't it? Whether there's any impact. Was it? Did you?
Hi, I'm Elsa from the British Library Learning Coordinator. You talked about the more admin that also just that involves. Did you have to? How did you plan for that? Did you have to get some more staff in, or how did that? Yeah, how did that work? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two parts to that. My role as an assistant learning producer is very much, that's kind of the main part of my role, is looking after the Access Fund, which was a new role a few years ago. But also I think kind of what we mentioned about starting small and getting big, it means that we kind of know where those bottlenecks are going to be and which parts create lots of admin. So as we grow, we're kind of not surprised by that, and we can plan more efficiently.
It's fair to say that we've had years when we've been caught out staffing wise on that, and we have to work, as Rosie said earlier, we have to work closely with our bookings team who take bookings generally and ask for their support, but then sometimes they're understaffed. So there's a big kind of conversation that happens around staff capacity. As Rosie says, we know when these big moments are happening, but other people draft in sometimes when it's, June and suddenly there are all these bookings. But it's the manpower and human power behind all this administratively is quite significant to make it all happen. It's one of the reasons that we've extended our funding this year, but we've only ploughed it into travel subsidy because we still felt like the amount of money we're offering was too much of a barrier not to have more people coming on site particularly. So our numbers of school visitors through Access Fund isn't going to change much, is it? We're just offering more money to enable them to come, because anecdotally we were finding that some of them they were successful, but they weren't actually booking because they phoned up a coach company and then realised, oh God, it's still too expensive. So that's the sort of thing we're finding out. And we couldn't, on site, Hampton Court was still only 3 days a week for schools. We can't necessarily in June or May accommodate too many more groups as well. So it's that kind of consider all those factors to take into account.
Thank you. One last quick question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kate from Fulham Palace. I know obviously it's the Schools Access Fund, but do you have any involvement with home education groups or any plan to offer it to home education groups in the future?
Really good question that actually someone did ask us recently. So our home education offer, it's fair to say, is still in its early inception. So we've just had a year where we've piloted some days across our 3 sites. And at the moment, no, the Access Fund, we haven't got our head around that audience and their needs yet, but that will be definitely something that we will be looking into for sure. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. You were quick with that. So we have actually got time for one more. Yes, at the back.
Hi, is the toolkit available online?
Well, it's not. We sort of put it together for this, really. It's not a thing as such.
Yeah.
But we can certainly do that, can't we? Because it's actually, we could probably make it more comprehensive than it has been for this. First think about this, then do that, then and actually when this was put together, neither of us actually worked on the scheme in year 1.
Right.
So neither of us were there at the inception actually. But we've been involved throughout, and there's lots of lessons learned, and there are some key things. So we can find a way to produce something,
Could be really useful to put on the GEM website as well, on their resource section. I think it'd be really great. Is the and just to see an application form example as well would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, we can absolutely provide an application form example, but it is actually, because our applications are open at the moment, if you did want to go on our website and have a look, it's on there at the moment. So just on hrp.org.uk.
That was a great question to end with, though. And of course, if you make that toolkit, as it's just been christened, available, that adds another layer of impact for your further funding, doesn't it, for your development team? So thank you both very much. Let's Thank you again.